Hi there, this is Colin McGarry with Walking D-Day. Today we're into Totalize II. Totalize I had broken through the German defences by getting up onto the Borgebou Verrières Ridge and advancing 5 miles. The operation started at night and it didn't use pre-advanced bombing, aerial bombing that is, but bombing on the flanks, and depended on artillery barrage, a rolling artillery barrage, to clear the way for the advancing troops. Totalize II was to start in daylight around midday on the 8th, and then there would be a pre-attack bombing carried out by the Americans. I'm here on Hill 112, which is taken by the Royals, the Canadian troops. Further east is Saint-Aignan-de-Crémenil, and that had been taken by the North Yeomanry with the Black Watch. The Canadian 4th Armoured Division and the Polish 1st Armoured Division were to exploit the gains of Totalize I and advance through the troops, advance to the highland just north of Falaise. So the Canadians to Hill 195, 195 metres, and the Poles to Hill 140. Now the Canadian 4th Division was commanded by Major General Kitching, and the Poles were commanded by General Maszczyk. Totalize I had gone pretty well, and General Simmons had thought of dispensing with the bombing raid of the Americans for Totalize II and just carry on. But getting the bombing raid had taken a lot of negotiation, so it would be difficult to cancel it. Allied intelligence had failed to point out that the 1st Panzer Division had gone west to Mortain for the Operation Lüttich. General Simmons thought they were still just south of him. Michael Wittmann had a meeting with Muller and Kurt Meyer at Caen, which is a mile down there. Kurt Muller, from just north of Caen, he'd seen the massed tanks of the Canadians and he wondered why they weren't attacking. Well, then he saw a bomber dropping flares and guessed there was going to be a mass bombing raid. So he decided to send the panzers north to attack the Canadians and to get them north of the bombing. The bombing raid was carried out by the USAF Air Force. The 680 bombers arrived at 12:55. Their targets were Bretteville-sur-Lez, Saint-Sylvain and Gaumesnil on the Caen-Falaise road. They approached from the west to cross in front of the Canadians, so were subjected to more flak. This disrupted formations and 10 bombers were shot down. Now low cloud, smoke and the flak sent some bombers off course, and some bombers dropped their bombs on the Canadians and the Poles, causing 64 deaths and over 200 casualties. Only 492 bombers of the 680 dropped their bombs, as the others couldn't find their targets. They just went back without dropping them. All this happened as the panzers were advancing north from Caen, led by Wittmann and his 4 Tigers. Now, even though they were advancing across the open land, no bombers changed course to bomb them. Now the North Ants saw them. Joe Aiken was in a Firefly by an orchard just over there. He started firing and knocked out 3 Tigers. The 4th one, Wittmann's, was probably knocked out by a squadron of Sherbrooke Fusiliers just behind the wall at Gaumesnil chateau. They were commanded by Major Radley Walters. So in about 10 minutes, half the available Tigers had been knocked out. They had achieved nothing in the battle. The famous action of Wittmann and Villers-Bocage and his demise has been covered in this video. Now, WalderMuller's Mark IVs had advanced from the Jardinets, which is near Couvix, towards the Del del Roc, which is just below where the North Ants were, near Saint-Aignan-de-Crémenil. Now they managed to knock out 20 British tanks before machine gun fire and artillery pushed them back. So the German counterattack had failed. Now, the Polish 1st Armoured Division, they'd been bombed. They were hastening their way to the front line. Coming through Caen, they'd been bombed as they left Caen. And then they came past Saint-Aignan-de-Crémenil. Some came to the right, most came to the left, which is the east. Communication with the British was difficult due to language, and the Poles also had different code names for the objectives. Now they didn't know that WalderMuller's tanks were behind the hedges, which were along here. There were many more trees than there are now. And within a short time, 40 tanks were knocked out, and the survivors went back to Saint-Aignan-de-Crémenil to regroup. Now the panzers pressed on their attack towards Saint-Aignan. It wasn't until 1500 hours that, by setting fire to fields where the German troops were, the attack was stopped again and the situation was controlled. Now, after spending 2 hours regrouping, the Poles started advancing again. They were going very cautiously. They were passing the wrecks of their comrades as they went forward. And by the end of the 8th, they'd only gone a mile south of Saint-Aignan-de-Crémenil. The Canadian 4th Armoured Brigade hadn't suffered the same way from the bombing, but they still didn't advance as hoped. They were led by the Canadian Grenadier Guards, accompanied by the Lake Superior Motorised Infantry. The leading group was called the Halpenny Force, after its commander, Leftenant Colonel Bill Halpenny. The Halpenny Force started moving at 3 a.m, coming from Caen, and at dawn they were just at Trotval farm, which is here. It wasn't until 8 a.m. that they were past Gaumesnil and actually in a position to take on the German forces. The commander of the 4th Brigade was Brigadier Booth. Both he and Lieutenant Colonel Halpenny seemed to be in a pretty lethargic state. Passing Gaumesnil to the east, 2 squadrons were held up by anti-tank fire. Major Smith contacted Lieutenant Phelan of No. 4 Troop. The left is held up. Can you make an end run on the right? Phelan led his 4 tanks between Tout and the railway line. He saw a flash coming from the north of Tout. He knocked out the 88mm. More anti-tank fire came from another direction. With the other tanks covering him, Phelan advanced within 100 yards and knocked out 2 more 88s and 2 flak guns. He realised the field was now full of Germans. The Argylls infantry had gone towards Tout. Phelan told the men to dismount and attack the Germans. A self-propelled gun exploded, causing the burning tree to fall on Sergeant Hurwitz. He wriggled out and joined Phelan in attacking the Germans. 31 prisoners were taken, 2 more 88s were destroyed, and 2 20mm guns. Phelan got a military cross and Hurwitz the military medal. There was still some daylight left, but the Halpenny force had stood down. Now, by the end of the 8th of August, the Canadian troops had advanced 2 miles and the Poles 1 mile. Now, the Germans took advantage of the lull in air activity during the night to bring up ammunition and to set up a defence line from Moutier-en-Sanglé near the River Orne to Moult in the east. They also brought up the 85th Division. General Kitchen tried to contact Brigadier Booth by radio, but he couldn't, so he came to find him. And he found Booth asleep in his command tank. So he dragged him out and he bawled him out. And now he sent the Halpenny force to take Bretteville-le-Rabat and Hill 195. But then they realised that was a bit optimistic. The Halpenny force was to take Bretteville-le-Rabat and the Worthington force was to take Hill 195. Now the Poles got the same order to advance during the night, but as they were on less supervision, they decided to stay put until daybreak on the 9th. Now the Wellington force was at L'Orguichon, They left there at 2:30 a.m. and they got to Caen at 4 a.m. Now the plan was to go straight down the road to North of Falaise and then bifurcate to the right to take Hill 195. But as they approached Breche, they came under fire from the Germans there, and so they skirted round to the left or to the east to go round Breche, and they would get back on the road afterwards. That was now the seeds of a fatal error were sown. Now coming from round Breche, they crossed this road here without realising it, then veering to the right, they found it again, coming from the east. Now it was a dead straight road, going practically south, and Worthington took it to be the Falaise road. But it wasn't. It was a road called the Lane of the Duke, after William the Conqueror. He used it in 1047 to get away from assassins near Cherbourg. But it was built by the Romans. So they carried on down this road thinking it was the Falaise road, and then they saw a hill which seemed to be in the right place, and they went up it with no resistance from the Germans. Now they were actually on Hill 140, which was the objective for the Polish troops. They were 6 miles from their objective, Hill 195. So Worthington contacted HQ and he said, "We're on Hill 195. Obersturmführer Michal was sent to Hill 140 to contact Kampfgruppe WalderMuller. He was fired on by the Canadian tanks. His armoured car wasn't hit. He managed to get away. He went to Kenny Wood, where the 12th SS panzers were, and told them there were troops on Hill 140 to organise a counterattack. Kurt Müller was at his command post at the Breche du Diable, and from there, it's some way from the Hill 140, but from there he could see the hill and the first attacks. So now he went to Kenny Wood to organise further attacks against the Canadians. Now this mistake could have been turned into a victorious breakthrough, but more mistakes compounded to turn it into a real tragedy. At 8 a.m, HQ contacted Worthington and asked him to confirm his position, and he repeated that he was on Hill 195. Because at HQ they were surprised because they couldn't see any troops from a distance on Hill 195. Then later an RAF plane flew over, and seeing tanks, they thought they were Germans and attacked them. So they were attacked by the RAF. And then the Polish tanks arrived. They set off at daybreak, and they first thought they were Germans, so they fired on the Canadians until the Canadians showed the orange flare, showing they were friends. But then the Poles were attacked by the Germans, so the Poles were trying to help the Canadians, but after a fierce attack from the Germans, they pulled back. Now they knew where they were, but they didn't tell anybody else that there were Canadian troops on Hill 140. Now half-track was sent out with wounded men, and they got to HQ, but they still thought they'd been at Hill 195, and so they couldn't give any useful information. Now the rest of the troops were practically annihilated. I've done a whole video on the Worthington Force, and the link is just up here. The east flank was being cleared by the 49th Division and the 51st. They achieved their objective at Billy after a week. The 49th Division were coming from Caen. The Hill 195 was taken in the early hours of the 11th of August by the Argyll and Southern Highlanders. They walked up in single file during the night of the 10th, avoiding the German defences on the west, and dug in. The taking was easy, with no casualties, but then they had to hold against a fierce counterattack. The Hill 140 was still in German hands, and the 7 miles to Falaise would take another week, and that would be Operation Tractable.